I think we need to stop the third world coming to Britain. We cannot take any more of it, can we? We have simply had enough.
Over 50 storefronts shattered. Violent crime rates up 40%. Up to 1,200 illegals arriving by boat in a single day. On the streets of Birmingham, fireworks were set off, not in celebration, but as an act of defiance, following the leak of documents allegedly linked to Starmer detailing the so-called mass replace plan. Ordinary citizens were outraged. A simple message spread rapidly: we can't take it anymore. The government, however, dismissed these accusations, labeling them nonsense, conspiracy theories, and misinformation. Ministers spoke calmly, even as tensions simmered beneath the surface. Hotels housing migrants were overflowing. Taxpayers watched billions of pounds disappear while public services collapsed and national security weakened. By early evening, the atmosphere had become intensely charged. This was no longer a peaceful situation, yet it was not officially a public protest either. Britain is on the brink, whether its leaders are willing to admit it or not. At 7:15 p.m., emergency calls rang incessantly. The sirens of British police cars echoed through the streets. Windows were smashed. Shops that had survived the lockdown were devastated within minutes. By 7:43 p.m., police radios broadcast a message that sent shivers through command centers. Zones 8, 9, and 13 have fallen. We need reinforcements immediately. This was no ordinary chaos. Officers were overwhelmed, pushed back street by street. As the clock struck 8 p.m., the situation escalated violently. Crowds surged towards police vehicles, surrounding them from all sides. Flares and fireworks lit up the sky as shouts echoed through the streets. "Stop the boats! Stop the boats!" The message was no longer symbolic. It was direct, violent, and unstoppable. Police shields were pelted with bottles and debris. Vehicles shook as officers inside braced for impact. Entire neighborhoods descended into chaos within moments. Social media was flooded with live videos showing police retreating, fleeing, and struggling to hold their positions. Anger filled the smoke-choked streets. Many felt betrayed by the law, believing Starmer's new legislation would ruin Britain. By the end of the hour, it was clear. The streets were no longer under police control. They were becoming battlefields. And this was only the beginning of a new riot. By 8 p.m., the emergency alarms sounded like the end of the world. Across England, hotels housing migrants were overflowing. Taxpayers were spending $8 million a day feeding these so-called wild migrants. At the same time, violent crime was skyrocketing. Knife attacks had increased by over 200% since 2000. This was the reality people were living with. The government was not on their side. Then came the moment that added fuel to the fire. Nigel Farage stepped forward with what he called the missing piece of the puzzle, a blueprint, a long-term plan. According to circulating figures, an additional 1.6 million migrants were expected to arrive, and even the government was quietly admitting that there was nowhere to house them. In Northern Ireland, the streets reacted immediately. At 8:40 p.m., the situation collapsed. Protesters stormed police barricades, using shards of glass salvaged from looted shops to smash riot shields. Officers recoiled as pressure mounted. 2 police platoons were forced to retreat. The situation spiraled out of control. Minutes later, migrant reception centers and hotels were hastily reinforced with barricades as officials tried to protect what they could. But it was too late. At 9:10 p.m., the final fuse was lit. Body camera footage from police officers leaked online. Within 2 hours, the video had garnered 8.6 million views. Comments erupted with outrage. Accusations of betrayal poured in. Officers were branded traitors. The government was accused of abandoning its people. This was no longer a protest about policy. It was a moment of realization. For many watching, everything suddenly became clear, and the anger became irreversible. That night crossed a line that Britain had never crossed before. After 9:10 p.m., the chaos on the streets began to take on a darker shape. What had looked like random disorder was now being explained as design. Critics pointed to the numbers that suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. 1.6 million migrants were projected to arrive, yet officials admitted there was nowhere to house them. Almost at the same time, the government announced a massive housing initiative, 1.5 million new homes. The timing, they said, was no coincidence. Then, attention turned to the countryside. A new 20% inheritance tax on family farms meant that when a father died, his son could be forced to find $300,000, often while earning 10 times less. For many families, there was only one outcome: they would have to sell. Generations of farmland would be lost, not through neglect, but through legislation. The land did not vanish. It was reclassified. Productive agricultural fields were redesignated into what officials called the Gray Belt. According to critics, this was not about planning reform. It was about acquisition. Thousands of acres, once used to grow food, were now cleared for development, and the scale of that development was staggering. Plans emerged for 12 entirely new cities, rising where crops once grew. The government framed them as solutions to a housing crisis. Opponents called them something else entirely: state-sponsored settlements built to absorb the incoming population. The argument followed a brutal logic: bankrupt the rural population, acquire the land, pour concrete over fields, build the homes, settle the overflow. And these homes, critics warned, were never intended for British working families who had spent years on waiting lists. They were necessary infrastructure to house the 1.6 million asylum seekers the Home Office knew were on the way. As this picture came together, anger deepened. Farmers saw their livelihoods written off as collateral damage. Rural communities, which make up over 17% of Britain's population, felt deliberately targeted. These were people who had never voted Labour, who distrusted central power, and who now believed they were being sacrificed for a demographic strategy. What the government called growth, opponents called engineering. This was not mismanagement, they argued. It was coordination, a cycle so precise it could only be intentional. By late evening, the conclusion spreading online was clear. The riots were not about looting. They were about land, homes, and the future of the country. The streets were reacting to a plan people believed had already been set in motion, and once seen, it could not be unseen. As the night wore on, the argument shifted again. This was no longer just about housing, crime, or land. It became about power. Opposition figures began laying out what they claimed was the real objective behind the numbers. According to their warning, immigration was not being managed, it was being weaponized. The logic, they said, was brutally simple. New arrivals were given accommodation, they received benefits, they were protected, funded, and settled. And after 5 years, they would be granted passports, citizenship, the right to vote. That was when the political implications hit home. A resurfaced pre-election video of Keir Starmer spread rapidly across social media. In it, he delivered one sentence that now felt ominous. "I need 10 years to realize all my plans in politics." For protesters gathering in Parliament Square, the timeline suddenly aligned perfectly. 5 years to citizenship, a second general election, a potential second term. By that point, hundreds of thousands of new voters, many dependent on the state, would be eligible to cast ballots. The accusation hardened into a single phrase repeated across the streets and online forums: an imported electorate. Critics claimed these new citizens would not just vote, but vote predictably: hotels today, housing tomorrow, benefits now, passports later, and then, at the ballot box, loyalty. Not to Britain, they argued, but to the party that brought them in. Inside the House of Commons, the issue detonated. MPs shouted over one another as Starmer, visibly rattled, dismissed the allegations as absolute nonsense. But denial only fueled suspicion. The statistics kept coming. English families now averaged 1 child, maybe 2. Meanwhile, for many arrivals from Africa and the Middle East, family sizes averaged 3 to 7 children. Critics warned this was not just a cultural difference, but a demographic accelerator, one that would permanently reshape voting patterns. Nigel Farage doubled down. He argued that the housing initiative was not social policy, but electoral infrastructure. Homes were not being built for struggling British families. They were being built to secure future majorities. Outside Parliament, the reaction was explosive. Protesters coined another term: an alien army. Not soldiers with weapons, they said, but voters with ballots, imported, protected, and timed to arrive just in time for elections. To them, this explained everything: the refusal to secure the borders, the $8 million a day hotel bill. The silence as rural communities collapsed. It was not incompetence, it was calculation. As the accusation spread, the mood hardened. This was no longer about reversing a policy. It was about stopping a process already underway. People believed their voices were being diluted by design, their votes outnumbered before they were even cast. By late night, one conclusion dominated the conversation. This was not a temporary crisis. It was a long game, and the public believed they were discovering it too late. What began as unrest over immigration had now transformed into a full-scale rejection of political legitimacy itself. And once that trust breaks, it does not return quietly. By the end of the night, the damage was no longer symbolic, it was measurable. In just 3 hours, police confirmed 41 arrests and the destruction of 16 police vans. In several boroughs, officers quietly withdrew after dark, conceding control of specific zones. Authority did not fall with an announcement, it simply stepped back. As the streets burned, the narrative shifted again. Protesters, fathers, mothers, workers, were rapidly branded far-right extremists by major media outlets. That label landed like fuel on the fire. Many watching felt erased, dismissed, and deliberately misrepresented. The comparisons driving the rage were impossible to ignore. Veterans sleeping in freezing doorways, pensioners turning off their heating to survive winter. Meanwhile, migrant centers ran at full capacity, guarded, funded, and protected, at a cost of $8 million a day, paid by the very people being pushed to the margins. The message people took from this was devastatingly simple. The state would tax you into hardship, but subsidize others into comfort. It would seize your inheritance, but grant amnesty to those who arrived illegally. The law, they believed, no longer applied equally. Police body cam footage, live streams, and on-the-ground reports reinforced that belief. Officers were seen retreating. Laws appeared selectively enforced. Peaceful rural protesters faced swift punishment, while entire streets descended into chaos unchecked. This was no longer about immigration alone. It was about fairness, about betrayal, about a government accused of prioritizing non-citizens over its own people. The video's conclusion was uncompromising. When a state breaks its side of the social contract, order does not dissolve slowly, it snaps. The riots were not mindless destruction. They were the sound of a public realizing its taxes were funding its own displacement. This was not the end of the crisis. It was the confirmation of it. And once that realization takes hold, no amount. When the fires die down and the streets fall quiet, one thing will remain, a question that cannot be boarded up or explained away. Behind every statistic are real people. Shop owners watching a lifetime of work shattered. Farmers facing the loss of land their families held for generations. Pensioners choosing between heating and food. Police officers caught between duty and doubt. And communities struggling to recognize the country they thought they knew. This video is not about hating newcomers. It is about trust, about whether a government still feels bound to the people who fund it, obey its laws, and built the society it now governs. A nation can survive hardship. What it cannot survive is the belief that the rules no longer apply equally. So here is the question that matters most tonight. If you were standing on those streets, would you feel protected by the system or replaced by it? Take a moment, think carefully, and ask yourself what kind of country you want to wake up to tomorrow.